Just, be careful out here on these bird scooters. They're not, they don't take prisoners for sure. Anyway, on to happier news. E-scooters are anarchic. Hate them. I do want to talk about what I've been reading a little bit. I think that, I've been reading a lot of books and Readwise articles lately, and I haven't really gotten a chance to kind of like connect them in my head. And I want to write down and do a book report of some of my ideas that I've had while reading these books, and maybe come to a few kind of interesting shared conclusions between them. So these images that you're seeing are actually from the Readwise beta reader app, which is a super cool app. The team has done an amazing job at really capturing what a read later app should look like, as well as like the highlighting experience, and they put it all into one app and it feels just great. I've been using it specifically actually in the gym. Like all three of these articles I didn't actually read, I listened to and then went back and highlighted the things that were interesting. So my workflow with this has been to turn on like save some of my favorite articles from like Hacker News or something like that, and then later in the gym or while I'm walking, I just click through them and I just listen to them, and then I go, and when I hear something interesting, I open the app and I highlight it, and then I close it and go back to my walk or my workout, and it just feels great. It feels super smooth, and the work that they've done on it has been super impressive. This book, I've talked about it before, The Dream Machine. I'm going to be talking about it again because I'm still not done with it. It's actually taking me forever long to read because for some reason my brain is like having to store every single word that it reads in this book, and it's taking me forever. Then I'm also reading that this Forces Uprooting Us Move book that I haven't really gotten too far into, but I definitely want to talk about my thoughts on it so far. And then these two articles that are also, this actually is heavily related to this one showed me this one recommended, I guess, or referenced this book, and then we're going to talk about this as well. So I'm going to move these up here so that they all have their own space, and then we're going to like try and link them. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about this one first. When money is abundant, knowledge is the real wealth. So the main takeaway from this article was that money is power up to a point. So the author's point was that money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy knowledge. And his example was like, what happens if you were Jeff Bezos or something and you had billions of dollars and somebody told you that you could cure cancer with one of those billions of dollars? You'd probably spend $1 billion to solve cancer for the entire world's population. But the problem is that there's a bunch of people who are all kind of coming after you saying that, no, I have the cure for cancer, or I have the cure for cancer. And everyone's raising their hand being like, no, me, pay attention to me. I'm the one who has the cure for cancer. So knowledge actually serves as a bigger bottleneck than money. Another example that this author gave was Louis XIV, who is going to come up later, actually. So Louis XIV died because of, no, that's gangrene. Oh, no, it was Louis XV. Louis XV. There we go. So Louis XV died of smallpox. And that same year, a dairy farmer immunized his wife and children with cowpox, which could have been used to save him against smallpox. Let's see if we can find a picture of Jesty. Apparently Jesty is the guy who I'm looking for. Yeah, here we go. So this guy, to save his daughter's life, the same year that Louis XV died of smallpox, this man immunized his daughter against cowpox for the first time, which actually started the smallpox immunizations. And that's pretty interesting to me, right? Because I, obviously in the PKM space, spend a lot of time thinking about knowledge and how useful knowledge is and how you can move around different kind of knowledge bits and try and get unstuck. And I'm a big fan of making checklists and to-do lists and stuff like that too, to habitualize things that can be habitualized. But it brings up a point that I think is even more prescient for the current kind of tech landscape, where a lot of people in tech are making a lot of money doing relatively the same thing. So money is actually a really cheap value compared to knowledge, and how hard it is to acquire real knowledge and how difficult it is to move knowledge from point to point. So let's say that time spent earning knowledge will go farther than making more money. And that's an interesting point, right? Because like we as a society generally really, really highly value money, where we really want to make a lot of money and we think that money can help us buy our way out of all problems, when the author's point or thesis in this piece is that it is not money after a certain point. Like obviously money can buy you out of until you can afford subsistence living, right? Like you can afford a nice apartment in a safe area. You can send your children off to a good school. You can afford the foods that you want and a vacation, as well as pay for medical care in the country that you live in. Once you reach that point, money doesn't actually buy you more, it just buys you nicer. And you trade in your Corollas for a Ferrari. You trade in your flat for a mansion. And what this author is kind of proposing is that knowledge actually serves as a much bigger bottleneck to happiness than or wealth than money does, even, which is interesting because like we usually think of money as wealth, but this author's point is that knowledge is wealth. Flee to Michigan as soon as possible. So this one has a different kind of tune. This one's tune is basically that move to Michigan. Move to Michigan. So basically this author's point is that Michigan is best for climate change. The article itself didn't really get into why. It just kind of recommended that we read the book, but broadly speaking, it seems that it's just resilient to climate catastrophe. The author did bring up an interesting point though, where he was saying, oh, you know, like these cities that have the youth of the country and everybody is like a digital nomad these days. Like what happens when digital nomading becomes so prescient that nobody, you know, wants to live in these kind of like biggest urban cities, and they want to live in a place that's a little bit more laid back and it has a smaller community where people can really focus on each other. And I think that's a really interesting question. I really don't know how this remote work stuff is going to play out as a remote worker myself, but it does seem like there is a reality of the climate change stuff that's going to be happening, as well as people needing a place to live, right? And that actually leads me into this next book here, which I've just started, which so far has been a lot of climate catastrophe stuff about specifically immigration, as well as what does it mean to be mobile versus stable. So like mobility versus stability is a question that this author asks a lot. And I think that this is an interesting question too, right? Because these two things are obviously very highly related. So there's like a very much one-to-one relationship between migrants fleeing climate disaster places and the mobility that can be only afforded to people who can afford to pack up their stuff and leave. I haven't really gotten far enough in this book yet to comment too deeply. I would say that he does spend a lot of time, it feels like, complaining about things a little bit too much, I don't know. But hopefully I'll get to the solutions later on in the book. And then the last two, The Dream Machine, is about the history of computing and the transition of philosophy almost of what a computer is, which is really interesting. And it's a very deep question because it apparently for the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, it changed like every 10 years with the new generation of thinkers because this field was already moving so quickly even after World War II. But it's interesting to kind of like I think the way that I'm tying it into this bigger landscape here of these pieces that I've read is that it really kind of like looked at the idea of people being like, that idea is silly, this is silly, you know, like Cloud Shannon actually got a lot of pushback when he was trying to introduce binary logic to the differential analyzer, because people were just like, oh no, that doesn't make sense for what the differential analyzer does. It does integration. Like, why would you be trying to add circuits to this? There was a lot of pushback against transistors in the vacuum tubes era. A lot of people were like, vacuum tubes forever. And that's like, I think that kind of thought process it's dangerous, not because just it's holding in an individual back, it can hold societies back as well. And I like to think a lot about that in terms of like when something is just kind of accepted territory of thought. Is it accepted because it's correct, or is it accepted because changing it would be too difficult? Finally, the last story here is about our boy Francois Vatel, who literally this was a crazy read. I had no idea about this guy, but he was a servant / chef / something or the other, actually for Louis XIV, right? Louis XIV? Let me check. Yep, Louis XIV. And the Prince of Condé welcomed Louis XIV. So I'll just read this sentence out. Let me copy this and paste. In the spring of 1671, Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, am I saying that right? Welcomed Louis XIV to a 3-day visit at his chateau at Chantilly. The niceties of the weekend were supervised by Comtesse Maitre d' of the hotel, Francois Vatel, who died by, I don't know if I can say this on Twitch, even if it's just history, but he died in a way where it involved a sword and his own volition and running into said sword, because they were doing a fasted meal and there was no fish that were caught. And he thought there was no fish that were caught. There were fish, but the fish were coming a day later. So he didn't like that news. And and felt that his honor was on the line, and he ended up taking his life. However, the fish did arrive the day later, and basically France was completely torn up about it because there was the mixed messaging between the honor of dying because that you wanted to die for something that's like super important to you, like serving your king. So the dichotomy of dying for honor and the ridiculousness of dying for fish. And I thought the really interesting part about this piece was how the king's team had to switch it for propaganda. Like the team had to switch up the story so that the king didn't seem weak, and that the, you know, that basically the actions of Vatel didn't look badly on Louis XIV, right? Because if Louis XIV wasn't happy or satisfied, that would mean that he's not perfect or whatever, right? And that's just a really interesting kind of like concept. So these are the books and the articles that I've read. Now that I'm looking at them, I think obviously these two are very strongly linked. I think that this knowledge is power deals with propaganda pretty well. So like there's definitely a link between knowledge being power and click and click and click and propaganda. And then I think that the history of computing obviously was also a bottleneck. Like a lot of people in the computing space at the time were stuck because they were like, oh, well, we just can't do this. This technology isn't ready for this yet. And then finally, the knowing of kind of like, how am I trying to put this? Mobility versus stability has to do with like kind of like the king traveling, right? Which is that was kind of a reach. But I do think that there is a link there. And I think that, you know, me drawing these kind of connections is interesting because it really just shows you like how close these ideas really do exist in thought space, and that there's a lot of interesting stuff to read. So I'm definitely going to continue this tradition of kind of like going over things that I'm currently reading and kind of like talking through them, because it's helpful to me, but B, I think that it brings, you know, more intrigue to these books and articles, but then it also serves as a good point for conversation.